So I'm going to read first of all from the first book of Samuel. And I'm going to read from chapter 16, reading verses 1 to 13. God addressed Samuel. So how long are you going to mope over Saul? You know I've rejected him as king over Israel. Fill your flask with anointing oil and get going. I'm sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I've spotted the very king I want amongst his sons. I can't do that, said Samuel. Saul will hear about it and kill me. God said, take a heifer with you and announce, I've come to lead you in worship of God with this heifer as a sacrifice. Make sure Jesse gets invited. I'll let you know what to do next. I'll point out the one you are to anoint. Samuel did what God told him. When he arrived at Bethlehem, the town fathers greeted him, but apprehensively. Is there something wrong? Nothing's wrong. I've come to sacrifice this heifer and lead you in the worship of God. Prepare yourselves, be consecrated, and join me in worship. He made sure Jesse and his sons were also consecrated and called to worship. When they arrived, Samuel took one look at Eliab and thought, here he is, God's anointed. But God told Samuel, looks aren't everything. Don't be impressed with his looks and stature. I've already eliminated him. God judges persons differently than humans do. Men and women look at the face. God looks into the heart. Jesse then called up Abinadab and presented him to Samuel. Samuel said, this man isn't God's choice either. Next, Jesse presented Shammah. And Samuel said, no, this isn't the man either. Jesse presented his 7 sons to Samuel. Just lost my line there. Where are we? Samuel was blunt with Jesse. God hasn't chosen any of these. Then he asked Jesse, is this it? Are there no more sons? Well, yes. There's the young one, but he's out tending the sheep. Samuel ordered Jesse, go get him. We're not moving from this spot until he's here. Jesse sent for him. He was brought in, the very picture of health, bright-eyed, good-looking. God said, up on your feet, anoint him. This is the one. Samuel took his flask of oil and anointed him, with his brothers standing around watching. The Spirit of God entered David like a rush of wind, God vitally empowering him for the rest of his life. Samuel left and went home to Ramah. Always tickles me the fact that it starts at the beginning of that passage to say that God doesn't look at the outward presentation of a person, he looks at the heart. And then further on, towards the end of the story, he said it was good looking. But there you go. That's the scriptures for you. The principle is that God does look at the heart, and he knew David's heart was good. And so David is anointed. A mere slip of a lad, not a fully grown man. And whether Jesse decided that because he was the youngest he wasn't worth bothering about, or whether he just never thought about him because he was out in the field looking after the sheep, we don't actually know. He doesn't tell us. But he got dragged in at the last minute. So let's look now at John's Gospel and a passage from John chapter 9. And it's a fairly long one because it's the whole of the chapter, so pin back your ears. So, John chapter 9. Walking down the street, Jesus saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, causing him to be born blind? Jesus said, you're asking the wrong question. You're looking for someone to blame. There's no such cause and effect here. Look instead for what God can do. We need to be energetically at work for the one who sent me here, working while the sun shines. When night falls, the workday is over. For as long as I am in the world, there is plenty of light. I am the world's light. He said this, and then he spit in the dust, made a clay paste with the saliva, rubbed the paste on the blind man's eyes and said, "Go, wash at the pool of Siloam." Siloam means sent. The man went and washed and saw. Soon the town was buzzing. His relatives and those who year after year had seen him as a blind man begging were saying, "Why, isn't this the man we knew who sat here and begged?" Others said, "It's him all right." But others objected, "It's not the same man at all, it just looks like him." He said, "It's me, the very one." They said, "How did your eyes get opened?" "A man named Jesus made a paste and rubbed it on my eyes and told me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' I did what he said, and when I washed, I saw." "So where is he?" "I don't know." They marched the man to the Pharisees. This day, when Jesus made the paste and healed his blindness, was the Sabbath. The Pharisees grilled him again on how he came to see. He said, "He put a clay paste on my eyes and I washed and now I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "Obviously this man can't be from God. He doesn't keep the Sabbath." Others countered, "How can a bad man do miraculous, God revealing things like this?" And there was a split in the ranks. They came back at the blind man. "You're the expert. He opened your eyes. What do you say about him?" He said, "He is a prophet." The Jews didn't believe it, didn't believe the man was blind to begin with. So they called the parents of the man, now bright-eyed with sight. They asked them, "Is this your son, the one you say was born blind? So how is it that now he sees?" His parents said, "We know he is our son, and we know he was born blind. But we don't know how he came to see. Haven't a clue about who opened his eyes. Why don't you ask him? He's a grown man and can speak for himself." His parents were talking like this because they were intimidated by the Jewish leaders, who had already decided that anyone who took a stand that this was the Messiah would be kicked out of the meeting place. That's why his parents said, "Ask him. He's a grown man." They called the man back a second time, the man who had been blind, and told him, "Give credit to God. We know this man is an impostor." He replied, "I know nothing about that one way or the other, but I know one thing for sure. I was blind, and now I see." They said, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" "I've told you over and over, and you haven't listened. Why do you want to hear it again? Are you so eager to become his disciples?" With that, they jumped all over him. "You might be a disciple of that man, but we're disciples of Moses. We know for sure that God spoke to Moses, but we have no idea where this man comes from." The man replied, "This is amazing. You claim to know nothing about him, but the fact is, he opened my eyes. It's well known that God isn't at the beck and call of sinners, but listens carefully to anyone who lives in reverence and does his will. That someone opened the eyes of a man born blind has never been heard of, ever. If this man didn't come from God, he wouldn't be able to do anything." They said, "You're nothing but dirt. How dare you take that tone with us?" And they threw him out in the street. Jesus heard that they'd thrown him out and went and found him, and he asked him, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" The man said, "Point him out to me, sir, so that I can believe in him." Jesus said, "You're looking right at him. Don't you recognize my voice?" "Master, I believe," the man said, and worshipped him. Jesus then said, I came into the world to bring everything into the clear light of day, making all distinctions clear so that those who have never seen will see, and those who have made a great pretense of seeing will be exposed as blind. Some Pharisees overheard him and said, does that mean you're calling us blind? Jesus said, if you were really blind, you would be blameless. But since you claim to see everything so well, you're accountable for every fault and failure. So may God add his understanding to the reading of his word. Quite a long story. And at first glance, it's just another healing story. Jesus spitting into the dirt to make mud and smearing it all over the blind man's face. But then we're given the details of how that event was evaluated by those who saw it. And nobody seems to be able to figure out what happened. We start out with the disciples who asked him, who caused the man to be blind? Was it his sin or his parents? And this sets a bit of the context, because any disablement was regarded as a punishment from God, with that underlying their culture, if you like, at the time. And it's this that underlies the difficulties of those who see what happens. Then we have the neighbours and the friends, who can't figure out if this is the same person. Is this the same guy? Is it a different guy? And he keeps saying, I am the man. But they can't get their heads round it. So he tells them the whole story from beginning to end. And they still don't get it. So they take him to the Pharisees. And he repeats the whole thing. Well, the Pharisees don't get it either. So here comes the phone call to the parents. Is this your son? Well, yeah. And was he born blind? Yeah. How did he get cured? Don't ask me. Ask him. He's a grown man. Ask him. All I know is I was blind and now I see. And it kind of reminds me of the scene in The Chosen that we were watching the other day, when Matthew has witnessed this miraculous haul of fish. And he's challenged by the Roman garrison commander. And he says, I know what I saw, but I don't know if I can believe it. We do that, don't we? He knows he's telling the truth, and as a result, he's now the only one who can see properly. He's the only one with enough vision to see Jesus for who he is, to accept this miraculous healing that he's been given. Everyone else has the eyes to see, the physical eyes to see, but they don't believe what their eyes tell them. They lack the sight to believe it. And this comes back to the underlying assumption that we mentioned earlier about this understanding that blindness was a punishment from God. So why would God lift that punishment? Nicodemus, whose story we looked at last time, could well have been one of those Pharisees, and we know that he had great struggles in trying to understand what Jesus was all about. He had a struggle to accept Jesus for who he really was. It didn't fit his worldview. Now there's two kinds of questions that you can ask. Open questions and closed questions. And the closed questions might be something like, are you okay? And this gives someone the parameters, if you like, the limits as to you're expecting a yes or no answer. A more open way of asking the question might be, how are you feeling today? And that allows the person that you're speaking to say what they want to say rather than what you are forcing them into saying one way or the other. And the question shows how interested you are in the answer. And in this story, the disciples asked a closed question. They're looking for a simple answer from Jesus. It was his fault or it was his parents' fault. It's quite obvious it had to be one or the other. But Jesus moves them away from this way of thinking and leaves them with this metaphorical picture, a bit of a mystery, which is where the healing can happen. Instead of responding directly to the question the disciples asked, Jesus uses metaphors of light and darkness to explain why he's here in the world. Then he takes dirt and he spits on it, rubs it in his hands and smears it all over the man's eyes. The man washes in the pool, comes out, and he can see for the first time in his life. And that's where the chaos begins, because people just can't understand how that can be. From the time of their question through to the end of the story, their assumptions don't allow them to experience the miracle that's just happened. It prevents them from understanding what's going on here. In the reading from Samuel, we also see how assumptions get in the way. Samuel has been asked to make known the Lord's chosen one to replace Saul. Saul is now out of favour. He's lost the plot, as we might say. So Jesse's sons pass by Samuel, and the family assumes that one of the older sons will be chosen. They're strong and attractive men, and they assume that those are God's criteria. But finally, when David shows up, Samuel hears from God that he's the one and anoints him. This little scrap of a lad who's been sent out to look after the sheep, who wasn't given a second thought, whether deliberately or accidentally. Doesn't really matter. He was out in the field doing what little lads were expected to do, which was keep the family flock in order. God breaks through those assumptions and tells Samuel that David is the one to be anointed as king. Obviously not going to be king at this moment in time, because Saul is still in power. But in the fullness of time, that becomes the reality. And David becomes known as the best king humanity could offer. Perhaps in our world of hope this morning is that God will take all that we presume, all that we assume, all that we expect, all of our assumptions, all of our questions, breaks through them to create miracles. We were talking about this last time, about the possibility of miracles. We talked about it after the last film of The Chosen, which was all about healing miracles and how possible or impossible that might be. Maybe our good news is that even when we're all confused and don't understand and can't make head nor tail of what's going on, something will come from what happens. God is still in the midst of us. God is still working to heal those who are ready to be healed. That healing may or may not be physical. It may be spiritual healing. The fact is, we're all much more like the disciples and Jesse's family than we ever care to admit. And we ask closed questions. We ask questions where we think we know the answer. We're unable to accept the witness because it doesn't fit our worldview. It's too hard to explain. It flies in the face of our scientific, tangible, physical world that we observe around us. But the good news is our assumptions don't hinder God's work or get in the way of the prophets that he has chosen. Our questions don't stop Jesus from doing good in the world. So let's be honest about our confusion and stop asking closed questions and be prepared for the fact that something surprising might just happen in our lives too. God can and will break through our assumptions. So maybe that leaves us with some questions to think about while we have our brew.